Hi, my name is Bill Yosses, and I was lucky enough to be the pastry chef for two presidents, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And I'm going to be making President George W. Bush's favorite cake, the 7-layer chocolate cake. This was a cake that President Bush asked for his birthday. His birthday is actually July 6th, but we used to celebrate it on the 4th of July. It starts out with butter and sugar that we blend together in the electric mixer. I like to start with soft butter. You can either leave it out for a few hours on the kitchen counter. You don't want it to melt because when butter is melted, it separates into what's called the milk solids and the fats. And then we're going to add our sugar and we're going to put it on medium speed. So I'll tell you a story about my first impression of President Bush. It was when I went for my interview, and I was not aware that it would be face-to-face. So you're invited to make a cake and a dessert, sort of like a, test, which I did. And then I was invited to go up to meet the president. And so it was the president, the first lady, and Stephen Hadley, the national security advisor, and Condoleezza Rice. So these were people that I had read about for years and admired, and so obviously I was a little bit starstruck, kind of stuttered out, well, it's an honor to be here, sir. And without missing a beat, he just said, looked me in the eye and very humbly said, "It is for me too." That was the first impression that I got of being there face to face with him. And it's not the kind of impression that maybe a person would get from reading news stories about how the man was. But anyway, that was a great start, and I certainly learned how to make a cake that he enjoyed for his birthday, and I got the job. We're going to alternate liquids and dries. You slowly add the dry ingredients, which is flour, more flour, and the baking powder, cocoa powder, and then the liquids are whole eggs and buttermilk. And these are going to go in here alternately so it all comes together into a smooth mess. So now that the cake batter is mixed together, we're going to put it into our mold. Now we have the cake in its cake mold. We're going to bake it at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. What I mentioned before is that President Bush really loved desserts, yet he was very fit. He could still outrun the young Secret Service members who were with him when he used to do weekend rides in Camp David. He did mountain biking, and they could not keep up with him. He used to say to me, "You're the reason I have to exercise so much." But one funny story happened while I was at the White House. So I had overheard people talking that the president said, "Oh, I have to eat healthy, or I have to lose some weight," something like that. So for dessert that night, I thought I would do the right thing, and I would make a delicious apple salad. So we serve the apple salad. The butlers take it into the president, and right away the butler comes back with the plate, sets it down on the counter in the kitchen, and says, "Don't ever make that again." And I said, "Why? I heard that he wanted to have a healthy dessert." And he goes, "What happened was I put the dessert down and the president said, 'What's that?' And he said, 'That's apple salad, sir.' And the president said, 'Apple salad? Apple salad's not a dessert. Apple salad's a salad.' And got up and walked away. Believe me, there was no more apple salad served at the White House. And while we're letting this cool, we're going to make the icing that goes on top of it. Starts out with butter. We'll put that on double boiler, which means water boiling under this to melt the butter. At the same time, we're going to add our chocolate. We'll let that get started and start to melt before we add anything else. So there's a number of things that you learn when you start to work at the White House, and they're not really written down. Obviously, there's a few things which become evident right away. You always refer to the president as Mr. President. If he enters the room, you stand. Likewise for the First Lady. The prestige of the office, the honor of the office, obviously requires a lot of respect. as kitchen personnel, we always had to be ready. We used to say on time is 15 minutes late. Like you always had to be there 15 minutes before, ready to serve. And it so happens that George W. Bush was a fairly quick eater. He did everything with sort of deliberation and intent, and he just liked to get things done, and including dinner. But if a guest was not accustomed to being served at the White House, they may not have been aware of a very old tradition, which probably dates back to England and the kings and queens of England, and that is that when the head of state is finished eating, you're finished eating. So in the case of George Bush, he would sometimes get through his plate, and the butlers and service staff would clear his plate and everybody else's. So if you were a talkative person, you might not have very much to eat at a state dinner. The amazing thing is he was very, very fit, President Bush was, but I think most nights he ate dessert. And I think it was something he looked forward to after a hard day, like, well, at least I have a dessert to look forward to. Sort of the epitome of service at the White House in terms of food is the state dinner. And actually, it's also a political high point. The state dinner is sort of everything that the presidency tries to achieve rolled up into a 2 or 3 day ceremony. So for example, the head of state of the country arrives. There's been months and months of preparation. At the White House, we're trying to present the best of America, the best ingredients, everything the best we can. So we want America to be represented there. But at the same time, we want to honor the visitor. So I might include, for example, ingredients from that person's country, or a technique, a kind of dessert that they love in that country. Now that the cake is cooled, we're going to start cutting it. With about 3 fingers, you'll get 7 layers. And in order to be sure that our cake is even all the way up, we use the same piece of cake to guide our knife on the other layers. So now we're going to build the cake, and the filling is this beautiful chocolate icing. This cake is sort of like what the French might call a terrine, or it's a rectangular cake, rectangular and high. Working at the White House, there were some very interesting things that I learned about entertaining heads of state, things which don't always make it into the newspaper. But the state dinner is kind of the ultimate entertaining at the White House, the ultimate of kind of everything. It's statecraft, diplomacy, politics, everything important, all rolled into one. So for example, one of the last state dinners that the Bushes gave was for the president of Ghana, the West African country. Every state dinner is the same. There's a morning ceremony, they arrive, there is a military parade, there's a fife and drum corps, sort of like a Revolutionary War style, part of the army. They perform on the South Lawn. That's where the president gives a speech welcoming the head of state. And after that, they go in for lunch, and then they break up. The head of state goes into the Oval Office with the president. There's a lot of tradition going back decades or centuries even about how to receive a foreign head of state. And just to give you an example of how precise this is, one of the very interesting departments in the White House, located in the East Wing, the First Lady's Wing, is the calligraphy department. So for a true state dinner, each menu is handwritten in calligraphy by a member of this team. It's all not only drawn out in perfect script on these beautiful paper, but even more important than that, each country has, besides its flag, they also have what you might call, I think, heraldry or sort of coat of arms. And that's usually a very intricate sort of, it has dragons or lions or whatever each country uses. But in this case, the calligraphers had to draw that heraldry on the top of the menu card the size of a quarter. Think about that. I mean, they're using like, a mouse whisker to draw some of these like very intricate details, and they did it perfectly. times 200, times 300, however many people were invited to a state dinner. You know, it's one of the things I like to talk about, because there's this whole team of people who work at the White House who really don't get credit. They don't want to get credit. They don't want a lot of this sort of news to be out there because it's private to the family. But I always sing their praises because they're really like the unsung American heroes, I think. And many of them have been there for president after president, many administrations. In fact, I can tell you one story. One man, when I started working there, said, "Remember, don't throw the leftovers away, because Mamie Eisenhower told me that." And I thought he was joking. This man was not joking. He was in his 70s when I started to work there in 2007, and he had started working for Eisenhower. And as a young man, a very young man, he was Afro-American, started working like 20 years old in the White House, and he was still there. Imagine all he had seen, the American history he had seen. And he was devoted to his job. Basically, these are, you know, personal remembrances of families, but a real American treasure. So we've let our cake set up in the fridge, so it has a nice and firm surface. And now it's going to get the secondary glaze. At this point, we kind of overdo it. We kind of over pour this chocolate glaze on it. The beauty of this cake is its simplicity, and we just top it with a little chopped walnuts, and it's ready to slice and serve. This delicious cake, to me, is a symbol of the very straightforward and simple pleasures of desserts and food, and in a way, how food brings us together. Because you have to remember that when the President and Mrs. Bush hired me, they knew that I was a New Yorker, liberal Democrat, I mean, sort of saying the same thing, and yet they still hired me. Those extra considerations about political party didn't come into the conversation. And it's something that I admire about them. I'm grateful to them for giving me the chance to serve, and I'm proud of having worked for them. It's okay. No, the reason I say that, so I once remember Julia Child interviewing a chef, famous New York chef, who tasted his own dish and said, delicious. And she, of course, said, "If you do say so yourself." So I'm always leery about praising my own food too much.